Far beyond the maps of ordinary kingdoms stood a land called Elaria, where rivers sang melodies to travelers, silver trees chimed softly in the wind, and floating gardens drifted lazily across the sky like wandering islands. And in this remarkable kingdom, every child grew up hearing stories about the city of lost wonders, a legendary place hidden beyond the crystal peaks where forgotten inventions, magical treasures, and incredible secrets were said to gather. But while most people believed it was only a fairy tale, a young mapmaker named Rin believed it was real. One morning, while searching through stacks of dusty books in his crowded workshop, he discovered a golden compass hidden inside the cover of an ancient journal, and when he picked it up, the needle didn't point north or south, but instead spun wildly before settling on a direction nobody expected, pointing straight into the sky, which naturally raised a few questions. So Rin hurried into town, where curious villagers gathered around the compass and offered explanations ranging from invisible castles to giant sky whales. But everything changed when a traveller in a bright green cloak walked through the square, because the compass immediately began glowing and pointed directly at her. The traveller introduced herself as Lyra, an adventurer famous for collecting unusual stories. And after examining the compass, she laughed and explained that she had heard of such objects before, saying they didn't point toward places at all, but toward adventures, which was exactly the sort of answer Rin had secretly hoped for. And only a few days later, the two of them set off together to discover where the compass intended to lead them. Their journey carried them across golden meadows filled with flowers taller than houses, through forests where clever foxes delivered messages between villages, and into valleys where enormous turtles wandered peacefully, with entire orchards growing on their shells, while farmers climbed ladders to harvest fruit from their moving gardens. And every day seemed determined to outdo the last with new surprises. One afternoon they encountered a travelling merchant whose companion was a llama named Professor Pickles, a creature that wore spectacles and somehow looked extremely pleased about it. And the merchant refused to provide directions unless they solved a riddle, asking whether fish would learn to fly if clouds learned to swim, which left Rin thinking deeply while Lyra guessed randomly and Professor Pickles sneezed loudly, prompting the merchant to declare the llama's sneeze the correct answer. And since neither traveller understood what had just happened, they simply accepted it and continued onward, because adventure rarely paused to explain itself. Eventually, the compass guided them toward the crystal peaks, where sparkling bridges stretched between mountains above the clouds. And while crossing one of these bridges, they discovered dozens of colourful kites floating freely through the sky without string, each carrying tiny handwritten notes from travellers who had passed through years earlier, sharing jokes, stories, and bits of advice. And one note simply read, "If you find a door in the middle of nowhere, knock first," which seemed oddly specific until later that same afternoon, when they found a bright blue door standing alone on a grassy hill with absolutely nothing attached to it. After a brief discussion, they decided to knock, and to their surprise, the door swung open to reveal a cozy tea shop hidden in a pocket world filled with talking clocks, friendly cats, and shelves stacked with pastries shaped like tiny castles. And after enjoying tea and listening to a clock explain why Tuesdays were the most adventurous day of the week, they stepped back through the door and discovered Only a few seconds had passed outside. The compass continued leading them farther than any map recorded until they reached the edge of the world, or at least what appeared to be the edge, where a magnificent staircase made entirely of light stretched upward into the clouds, and with no better options available, they climbed, eventually emerging above the sky itself into a realm of floating islands connected by ribbons of glowing wind, while enormous whales drifted gracefully through the air carrying small forests upon their backs. And there they met a cheerful inventor named Toma, who travelled aboard a flying ship powered entirely by stories, claiming that exciting tales generated enough energy to keep the vessel aloft, which explained why he was constantly asking strangers about unusual experiences. Toma joined their expedition, and together they followed the compass through shimmering canyons, across rainbow rivers and into ancient observatories where giant telescopes pointed toward worlds hidden beyond ordinary sight. Until one evening the compass suddenly stopped spinning altogether and projected a beam of golden light across the horizon. The compass spun faster than it ever had before, scattering tiny sparks of golden light across the tower as Rin, Lyra and Toma watched in amazement. And then the needle stopped suddenly, pointing toward a distant section of sky where no island, mountain or cloud could be seen, only a shimmering patch of blue that looked completely ordinary, which immediately convinced them it was probably hiding something extraordinary. After gathering supplies and saying goodbye to the City of Lost Wonders, they boarded Toma's flying ship and followed the compass across open skies for several days, passing floating forests, drifting castles, and flocks of giant swans that carried mail between worlds, until one morning the compass began glowing so brightly that even the ship's crystal sails reflected its light. And directly ahead, the empty patch of sky unfolded like a curtain, revealing a hidden ocean suspended among the clouds. It stretched farther than the eye could see, sparkling beneath sunlight while waves rolled gently through the air without falling, and dozens of islands floated upon its surface, each shaped like something completely different, one resembling a giant book, another shaped like a clock, and another looking exactly like a sleeping dragon made from green hills and waterfalls. Fascinated, the travellers guided their ship downward and landed on the nearest island, where they discovered a bustling harbour filled with unusual vessels, including boats powered by music, ships with wings instead of sails, and one particularly ambitious canoe equipped with 12 tiny propellers and a teapot for unknown reasons. A cheerful sailor informed them that they had arrived at the Sky Sea Archipelago, a collection of islands famous for hosting the Great Festival of Curiosities, an event that occurred only once every 100 years and attracted inventors, explorers, storytellers, and dreamers from across countless lands. Naturally, Rin, Lyra, and Toma decided to attend. The festival was unlike anything they had ever seen, with streets lined by performers balancing on floating bubbles, artists painting sunsets before they happened, and bakers creating pastries that changed flavour depending on what memory you were thinking about while eating them. And everywhere the travellers looked, they found something new, from mechanical birds that recited poetry to gardens where flowers bloomed into tiny lanterns at night. However, the greatest attraction of the festival was something called the Maze of Possibilities, an enormous labyrinth that appeared only during the celebration, and changed its shape every hour, with legends claiming that anyone who reached its center would discover a surprise perfectly matched to their imagination. Thousands attempted the maze every year, but very few succeeded. Intrigued, the three friends entered together and immediately found themselves surrounded by corridors that shifted like puzzle pieces, doors that opened into unexpected landscapes, and staircases leading in directions that seemed to ignore the normal rules of architecture. At one point, they wandered through a hallway made entirely of giant piano keys that played cheerful melodies beneath their feet, and later they crossed a garden where butterflies carried tiny maps showing routes that vanished moments after being read. Despite the maze's tricks, the compass continued helping them navigate, glowing whenever they approached the correct path, until at last they reached the center where they expected to find treasure or some grand secret. Instead, they found a single round table with 3 empty chairs and a silver box resting in the middle. When they opened the box, they discovered 3 blank journals. Confused, Rin looked around for an explanation, but none appeared until words slowly began writing themselves across the pages, revealing a simple message. The greatest adventures are not the ones you find. They are the ones you create. For a moment, nobody spoke, and then Toma laughed because it sounded exactly like the sort of lesson an ancient magical maze would give after making people wander through impossible corridors for hours. The journals, however, turned out to be far from ordinary, because every time one of them wrote inside, the pages expanded to include maps, sketches and details about places they had visited, preserving every memory with incredible clarity. When they finally emerged from the maze, the festival was celebrating its closing night, and hundreds of floating lanterns rose into the sky while music echoed across the islands and reflected beautifully upon the suspended ocean. Standing beneath the glowing lights, Rin realized how much had changed since the day he discovered the golden compass hidden inside an old book, because he had set out searching for a legendary city and instead found friendships, stories, and entire worlds beyond imagination. Then, just as the last lantern disappeared into the stars, children raced across the fields flying mechanical birds made of polished wood and colourful fabric, while musicians appeared from hidden courtyards carrying instruments shaped like stars. And before the travellers could even introduce themselves, a cheerful crowd surrounded them with questions about where they had come from, what adventures they had experienced, and whether Professor Pickles, the spectacled llama, was actually real, which surprised Rin because he had no idea how anyone on this floating island knew about Professor Pickles. Eventually, an elderly woman wearing a cloak covered in embroidered constellations stepped forward and explained that they had arrived at the island of echoed stories, a place where tales from distant worlds somehow drifted on the wind and settled among the people like seeds, growing into songs, paintings, inventions, and celebrations. And according to the islanders, stories of Rin, Lyra, and Toma had already reached them long before the travellers themselves had arrived. The island's capital, known as Aurora Haven, sat at the centre of a vast valley surrounded by crystal towers and shimmering gardens. The streets curved gracefully between colourful buildings whose rooftops were covered with flowers, and every evening thousands of lanterns floated into the sky, carrying written wishes, jokes and sketches from the people below. One lantern drifted past Rin, carrying a drawing of a whale wearing a crown. Another contained a recipe for strawberry cloud cake. A third simply read, "Remember to smile at mysterious doors." Nobody seemed to know who wrote that one. The travellers quickly learned that Aurora Haven was preparing for a very special event called the Festival of First Discoveries, a celebration held only when the island's ancient observatory detected something completely new in the skies. This year, the observatory had found exactly that, a star that didn't exist on any map. The mysterious star had appeared only a few weeks earlier at the edge of the heavens. It moved unlike any ordinary star, changing position each night and occasionally shining in different colours. Scholars were fascinated. Inventors were intrigued. Children were convinced it was probably a giant magical cookie. The last theory was surprisingly popular. Naturally, Rin wanted to investigate. The next morning, the travellers climbed to the observatory at the island's highest peak. The building resembled a giant glass flower opening toward the sky, and inside stood telescopes taller than houses. When Rin looked through the largest telescope, he immediately understood why everyone was talking about the star. It wasn't behaving like a star at all. Instead, it seemed to be moving with purpose, almost as though it were travelling somewhere. As soon as he focused on it, the golden compass jumped in his hand. The needle pointed directly at the mysterious light. The room fell silent. Lyra slowly smiled. "That," she said, "is either very good news or the beginning of another ridiculous adventure." Toma grinned. Those are usually the same thing. Within 2 days, a new expedition was organized. The islanders provided supplies, maps, and a magnificent upgrade for Toma's ship. Skilled inventors attached shining crystal sails capable of catching currents of starlight itself, allowing the vessel to travel faster than ever before. They also installed a machine whose sole purpose was producing warm cinnamon pastries during long journeys. Toma declared it the greatest invention in history. The ship lifted from Aurora Haven amid cheers and floating lanterns, climbing higher than any of them had ever travelled. Soon the floating island became a sparkling speck below, while the mysterious star shone brighter ahead. Days passed, then weeks. The sky itself began changing. Constellations shifted into unfamiliar patterns. Rivers of light flowed between distant stars, and enormous celestial gardens drifted through the heavens, carrying glowing flowers larger than ships. Once, they even sailed through a cloud of sparkling seeds that gently bounced off the deck and burst into tiny, harmless fireworks. Then, one quiet evening, the mysterious star suddenly stopped moving. The travellers gathered at the bow. Far ahead, illuminated by golden light, floated a structure unlike anything they had ever seen. It looked like a city built entirely among the stars. Thousands of luminous bridges connected floating towers of crystal and silver. Gardens bloomed between clouds of glowing mist. Rivers of light flowed through the streets. Great circular platforms rotated slowly around the city, reflecting starlight across the surrounding sky. The compass glowed brighter than ever before. As they drew closer, they noticed hundreds of other ships arriving from every direction imaginable. Some resembled ordinary vessels, others looked like flying castles, giant birds, or floating libraries. Everyone appeared to be heading towards the same destination,